84,000. That's how many T-34 tanks the Soviet Union built. The most manufactured tank in human history. Heavier than the entire German submarine fleet. More numerous than all Nazi tanks combined. And many of them were built by women and children in roofless factories at 40 degrees below zero, while bombs fell from the sky. This is the story of how they did it.
The Soviet Union, 1937. Stalin's country was a sleeping giant. Wheat fields stretched for thousands of miles. Enormous factories spewed smoke into gray skies. And in the Red Army barracks, generals knew an uncomfortable truth. Soviet tanks were a joke. The T-26 and BT series were fast, yes, but their armor was thin as paper. During the Spanish Civil War, Republican soldiers threw gasoline bottles at Soviet tanks, and they burst into flames like matchsticks. The troops called them coffins on tracks. Stalin knew war with Germany was inevitable, and he knew that with those tanks, the Soviet Union would be crushed. That's when he called upon an unlikely man to solve the problem, a man who years earlier had worked in a candy factory. Mikhail Ilyich Koshkin. Remember that name. Koshkin was the son of poor peasants. He worked in a candy factory in Moscow before deciding he wanted to become an engineer. He studied, fought, climbed his way up. And in 1937, at 39 years old, he was appointed head of the design department at the Kharkov locomotive factory in Ukraine. His mission was simple in words, impossible in practice. Create a tank that was fast like a racing car, armored like a fortress, and armed like a warship, all while keeping costs low. The generals wanted a tank that could drive on wheels on roads and on tracks in the battlefield. Koshkin thought this was foolish. Wheels were complicated, heavy, and broke easily. So he did something risky. He convinced Stalin to let him build a second prototype, a different tank. Tracks only, simpler, stronger, deadlier. Koshkin's team worked day and night. Alexander Morozov handled the chassis, Nikolai Kucherenko the suspension, Mikhail Tarshanov the hull. Each one was a genius in his field. And then came the great innovation, sloped armor. See, if you place a steel plate straight on the front of a tank, a shell pierces it easily. But if you tilt that plate at 60 degrees, the shell hits and slides off to the side. It's like trying to stab a knife into a tilted cutting board. With 45 millimeters of sloped steel, the T-34 had protection equivalent to 90 millimeters of flat armor, double the protection at half the weight. The tank's heart was the V2 engine, a 12-cylinder diesel producing 500 horsepower. Diesel, not gasoline. This meant less fire risk when the tank was hit, and in war, that was the difference between living and dying. In January 1940, 2 prototypes were ready. Now, they needed to prove their worth.
April 1940, Koshkin had a bold idea. To prove the T-34 was tough, he would drive both prototypes from Kharkov to Moscow. 2,000 kilometers through dirt roads, mud, snow, and ice. The journey lasted weeks. The tanks crossed forests, traversed frozen rivers, climbed mountains, and they worked. The V2 engine roared without stopping. The wide 500-millimeter tracks gripped mud and snow like claws. In Moscow, Stalin personally inspected the tanks. He was impressed. Production was approved. But the journey took its toll. Koshkin, who insisted on accompanying the tanks personally, caught severe pneumonia during the trek. In September 1940, at 42 years old, Mikhail Koshkin died. He never saw his tank enter combat.
Let's step inside a Soviet factory and see how the T-34 was built, piece by piece. Everything began with the hull. Rolled steel plates were cut into precise shapes. The front plate, tilted at 60 degrees, was 45 millimeters thick. The sides, tilted at 40 degrees, were also 45 millimeters. Workers positioned the plates in metal jigs. Then came the welders, men and women wearing heavy masks, holding torches that spat blue and white sparks. The weld fused the metal, joining the plates into an armored box. At first, welding a hull took 200 hours, but the Soviets were masters of simplification. They eliminated unnecessary parts, changed the design to make welding easier. By December 1941, a hull could be welded in just 36 hours. With the hull complete, it was time to install what made the tank move. The V-234 engine was a masterpiece of Soviet engineering. It took 5 years to develop at the Kharkov locomotive factory. It was a 12-cylinder diesel engine in a V configuration, aluminum block to reduce weight, 500 horsepower, 38 liters of displacement. For comparison, a modern car has about 2 liters. This engine was a monster. At the factory, the engine arrived in a wooden crate, already assembled. Cranes lifted it and positioned it at the rear of the hull. Workers connected the transmission shafts, fuel lines, electrical cables. Diesel had enormous advantages. It was cheaper than gasoline. It burned slower, reducing fire risk, and it gave the T-34 a range of nearly 300 kilometers on a full tank. And the speed? 53 kilometers per hour on roads. For a tank weighing 26 tons, that was astonishing. The T-34's tracks were unlike any others of the era. 500 millimeters wide, almost double the width of German tanks. Why did this matter? Think of it this way. If you walk on snow wearing regular shoes, you sink. But if you wear snowshoes, your weight distributes and you float. The wide tracks of the T-34 did the same thing. While German panzers got stuck in Russian mud, the T-34 glided right over it. Each track was composed of dozens of steel links. At the factory, workers assembled the links one by one, connecting them with metal pins. Then the tracks were rolled up and positioned on the wheels. The suspension used the Christie system, with independent coil springs for each wheel. This gave the T-34 smooth handling even on rough terrain. The tank could jump over holes and trenches without throwing the crew from side to side. Now comes the part everyone wants to see, the cannon. The original T-34 carried a 76mm gun. At the time, it was the most powerful weapon mounted on any tank in the world, capable of piercing the armor of any German panzer from over 1,000 meters away. At the factory, the turret was cast in sand molds. Molten metal at over 1,000 degrees was poured into the molds. After cooling, the turret was cleaned, drilled, and equipped. The cannon arrived from the Kirovsky factory in Leningrad. Workers positioned it on the turret ring, connected the elevation and rotation mechanisms. The system allowed the turret to rotate 360 degrees manually. Each T-34 carried 77 shells, armor-piercing rounds to destroy tanks, explosive rounds for infantry and fortifications, all stored in compartments around the turret and in the hull. In 1944, when the Germans brought their fearsome Tigers, the Soviets responded. The T-34-85 was born, with an 85mm cannon capable of piercing any German armor.
June 1941, Germany invades the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa. 3 million German soldiers advanced like a dark tide. The tank factories stood directly in their path. Kharkov, where the T-34 was born, would be captured within months. Stalin issued a desperate order: evacuate everything. Machines, tools, raw materials, workers, everything to the east, to the Ural Mountains, beyond German reach. Imagine the scene. Enormous trains loaded with metal presses weighing tons. Entire families crammed into cargo cars, fleeing with whatever they could carry. 43 trains departed Kharkov between September and October 1941, but only 10% of the workers followed the machines. The rest stayed behind to fight or die. At the new factories in the Urals, women, elderly, and teenagers would have to learn to build tanks from scratch. Their destination was a city that would soon be known by a new name: Tankograd.
Chelyabinsk, an industrial city in the Ural Mountains. When the evacuated factories arrived, the people renamed the city Tankograd, the city of tanks. Conditions were brutal. The machines arrived before the buildings were ready. Workers assembled engines under open sky in temperatures of 40 degrees below zero. Their fingers froze to the metal. Many lost fingers, hands, even their lives. There wasn't enough food. There were no doctors. There was no heating. People slept on factory floors next to the machines they operated. But they didn't stop. Women who had never seen a tank learned to weld in weeks. 14-year-old teenagers operated industrial lathes. Each worker mastered 2 or 3 different jobs so the line would never halt. In December 1941, just weeks after arriving in the Urals, the first factories were already producing tanks. 25 T-34s rolled out of Nizhny Tagil that month. The following year, there would be thousands.
But no story about T-34 production is complete without mentioning Stalingrad. The Stalingrad tractor factory was one of the largest T-34 producers. In 1942, 40% of all T-34s came from there. Then the Germans arrived. The Battle of Stalingrad began, and the factory kept working. Let that sink in. While bombs fell, while bullets whistled, while German and Soviet soldiers fought hand-to-hand in the streets outside, inside the factory, workers continued assembling tanks. Tanks rolled off the production line unpainted, without all the finishing touches, sometimes with workers still inside making final adjustments. They drove straight from the factory to the front line. Sometimes the front line was across the street. The factory only stopped in September 1942, when the Germans finally captured it. But until that moment, every tank that left those gates went directly into the battle that would decide the war. The Soviets had a philosophy that the Americans and Germans couldn't grasp. Perfection is the enemy of production. The Germans built tanks like works of art, every weld perfect, every part polished, every bolt aligned. Beautiful, yes, but slow and expensive. The Soviets didn't care about beauty. If a weld was ugly but held, it was approved. If a part worked but wasn't flawless, it went into the tank anyway. Only one thing mattered. Does the cannon fire? Does the tank move? Then it's good enough. Between 1941 and 1943, Soviet engineers simplified 770 parts on the T-34. They completely eliminated over 5,600 parts. The cost of each tank dropped from 269,000 rubles to 135,000, half the price. While Germany produced around 20,000 tanks throughout the entire war, the Soviet Union produced 57,000 T-34s. Just T-34s, not counting other models.
June 1941, the first German panzers encountered T-34s near Minsk. A German gunner wrote in his diary,
Every shot seems to hit dead on, but the shells ricochet. The fire doesn't seem to bother the tanks at all. The Germans were accustomed to crushing their enemies. Poland fell in weeks, France in a month. But those Soviet tanks, German shells simply couldn't penetrate them. The 37mm cannon on the Panzers was useless against the T-34's sloped armor. Even the 50mm cannon barely scratched the paint. Only the 88mm anti-aircraft guns could bring down a T-34, and those were rare. The shock was so profound that the Germans had to completely redesign their tanks. The Panther and Tiger were born as a direct response to the T-34. The Soviets had changed the rules of the game. Before heading to the front, each T-34 underwent rigorous testing. The tank was driven to a proving ground. The engine was started, allowed to warm up. The driver accelerated, testing responsiveness, maneuvers in circles, zigzags, sudden braking. Then came the cannon test. The gunner aimed at targets at different distances, 100 meters, 300 meters, 500 meters. Each shot had to land within a minimal margin of error. The noise was deafening. The T-34 had little sound protection for the crew. When the cannon fired, the blast reverberated inside the hull like a church bell. Ears rang for hours afterward. Once approved, the tank received its crew: commander, gunner, loader, and driver. 4 men in a cramped, hot, noisy space, their home for the coming months of war. 84,000 T-34s were built, 57,000 during the Second World War alone. They were built by women who lost their husbands to war, by teenagers who should have been in school, by elderly who had already given everything for their country and still gave more. In roofless factories, in temperatures that froze metal, under bombs falling from the sky. The T-34 wasn't perfect. It was cramped, noisy, uncomfortable. But it worked. It moved. It fired. And there were so many of them. When the Soviet flag was raised over the Reichstag in Berlin in May 1945, it was the T-34s that had paved the way. 84,000 tanks, millions of workers, an entire nation fighting not just on the battlefield, but in the factories, the forges, the assembly lines. That was the miracle of the T-34, the tank that changed history.